In the summer of 1994, something happened inside WWE that nobody in the wrestling world had ever seen before, and nobody has truly seen since. A dead man walked back into the building, except this time, nobody could be completely certain which dead man it actually was. For years, The Undertaker had operated as something beyond a professional wrestler, something beyond a character, something that existed in a space where the normal rules of logic and reality simply did not apply. He was the Phenom, the Deadman, a force of darkness so carefully protected and so deeply embedded in the consciousness of every wrestling fan alive that the idea of anyone threatening his existence felt genuinely unthinkable. But the million-dollar man, Ted DiBiase, had never concerned himself with what other people considered unthinkable. He had spent his entire career proving that everything in this world had a price, and if everything had a price, then even the most sacred and untouchable things could be bought, corrupted, and weaponized for the right amount of money. What he unleashed on WWE in the summer of 1994 was not just a conspiracy or a cheap trick. It was an identity crisis that shook the entire foundation of the most protected character in professional wrestling history. And before it was over, a graveyard would be opened, an urn would be unearthed, and two Undertakers would stand face to face in the same ring at the same time, and only one of them would walk out. By 1993 and into 1994, The Undertaker had reached a level of dominance inside WWE that felt less like a winning streak and more like a force of nature that the roster had simply accepted as an permanent and unavoidable reality. Challengers came forward, studied his weaknesses, built their strategies around stopping him, and then found themselves staring up at the arena lights wondering what had just happened. It did not matter how big the opponent was. It did not matter how experienced or how motivated or how physically prepared they arrived. When the lights went down and the gong hit and that music began filling the arena, something changed in the atmosphere of every building he entered, and everyone inside it, fan and performer alike, felt it in a way that no amount of rational thinking could fully explain away. The matches he competed in during this period carried a quality that separated them from almost everything else happening in WWE at the time. This was an era of larger-than-life personalities and colorful characters, a roster full of performers who understood how to work a crowd and deliver entertainment on the grandest scale the industry could produce. And yet, when The Undertaker was involved, all of that noise somehow fell away and the audience found itself focused on something more primal, the question of whether this particular opponent, on this particular night, would finally be the one to solve a puzzle that had been confounding the entire locker room for 3 straight years. The answer was almost always the same, but the question never stopped feeling urgent. His relationship with Paul Bearer during this stretch was at its absolute peak, and that partnership added a dimension to his character that elevated every single thing he did inside the ring. Bearer was not simply a manager in the traditional sense of the word. He was a storyteller, a performer in his own right, whose facial expressions and vocal delivery and physical presence with that urn created a complete world around The Undertaker that extended far beyond what happened between the ropes. When Bearer raised the urn and The Undertaker's eyes rolled back and that surge of supernatural energy appeared to flow through his body, the audience responded not with cynicism, but with genuine belief, the kind of belief that the very best professional wrestling has always been capable of manufacturing in the right hands. What made The Undertaker's dominance during this period particularly remarkable was the way it coexisted with genuine vulnerability, without ever undermining the sense of invincibility he projected. He could be hurt. He could be knocked down. He could be taken to the edge of defeat by opponents who pushed him harder than anything he had faced before. But he always came back. He always sat up from moves that should have finished anyone else, always found a way to turn the tide at the moment when the outcome seemed most certain. That sit-up, that single, slow, impossibly deliberate rising from the mat, became one of the most electrifying images in professional wrestling, a moment that could transform an entire arena's energy in the space of 3 seconds. And then, without warning, the momentum that had been building for 4 years hit a wall that none of his opponents had been able to construct. The Undertaker began showing signs of weakness that went beyond the normal wear and tear of championship competition, a vulnerability that seemed to run deeper than physical damage, connected somehow to the urn and to forces that the WWE audience had been conditioned to take seriously, even when the rational part of their minds told them otherwise. The cracks were small at first, barely noticeable against the backdrop of everything he had built. But in professional wrestling, small cracks have a way of inviting exactly the kind of opportunist who has been waiting patiently in the shadows for precisely this moment to arrive. And Ted DiBiase, the million-dollar man, had never been a man who missed an opportunity when it presented itself, and the opportunity sitting in front of him in late 1994 was unlike anything the million-dollar man had encountered in his entire career, because what had just happened to The Undertaker was not simply a defeat or a setback or a temporary dip in momentum that time and preparation could reverse. It was a collapse of something far more significant than a championship reign or a winning streak. The Survivor Series casket match against Yokozuna had been designed from the beginning, not as a fair competition, but as an execution, a coordinated, carefully planned dismantling of the most protected character in professional wrestling history, carried out by virtually the entire villain community of WWE acting in concert. Superstar after superstar had poured through that curtain to help Yokozuna force the dead man's body into that casket, each additional interference sending a clearer message than the last that no single opponent could finish The Undertaker alone, and that finishing him had therefore required an entire roster working together toward the same violent conclusion. When that casket lid finally closed and the arena fell into the kind of silence that only genuinely shocking moments can produce, something changed in the atmosphere of WWE that went beyond the normal emotional rhythm of a pay-per-view result. The audience had been conditioned over 4 years to believe that The Undertaker could not truly be stopped, that the sit-up would always come, that the supernatural energy flowing through Paul Bearer's urn would always find a way to restore what had been taken. But this time the sit-up never came. This time the casket stayed closed, and the lid stayed sealed, and The Undertaker's voice, when it finally reached the audience one last time, came not from the ring, but from a ghostly image on the screen above the entrance, pale and distant and carrying the echoing quality of something speaking from a place much further away than the arena floor. He promised darkness and return and reclamation of everything that had been stolen, and then the image faded, and he was gone, leaving behind nothing but silence and the unsettling feeling that something irreversible had just occurred. The absence that followed was felt immediately and deeply throughout every corner of WWE's universe. The most dominant and carefully constructed character the company had ever produced had simply vanished from television, and the space he left behind was enormous in a way that became more obvious with every passing week he did not appear on screen. The locker room that had spent 4 years being unable to defeat him now existed in a world where his standard was gone, and the ceiling he had set for everyone around him had been suddenly and violently removed. And it was into precisely this vacuum, this leaderless, unbalanced, psychologically destabilized version of WWE's landscape, that Ted DiBiase arrived with that familiar smile stretched across his face and that cold, calculating confidence of a man who had already worked out exactly how to turn someone else's tragedy into his own personal advantage, because what DiBiase understood better than almost anyone else in that locker room was that The Undertaker's power had never resided solely in his physical presence or his in-ring ability, or even the supernatural mythology that Paul Bearer had spent years carefully constructing around him. It resided in the idea of him, in the image, the silhouette, the entrance, the music, the slow, deliberate movement, the rolled-back eyes, the sit-up from the mat. These were not simply performance elements. They were the building blocks of a legend, so deeply embedded in the consciousness of the WWE audience that the audience itself had become dependent on them in a way that created a very specific and very exploitable vulnerability. If you could not defeat The Undertaker by attacking his body, perhaps you could defeat him by attacking his identity. And if his identity could be purchased, replicated and weaponized by the right man with the right resources and absolutely no moral boundaries whatsoever, Ted DiBiase, the million-dollar man, was precisely that man, and what he had been quietly constructing behind the scenes while the rest of the WWE universe was still processing the shock of the real Undertaker's disappearance was something so audacious, so breathtakingly arrogant in its conception, that even by the extravagant standards of professional wrestling, it managed to feel genuinely unprecedented. DiBiase had spent his entire career operating on a simple and devastatingly effective philosophy that every human being on the planet had a price, that loyalty and integrity and principle were simply virtues waiting for the right number to be attached to them before they crumbled entirely. He had bought bodyguards and valets and championship opportunities and crowd reactions across an entire decade in WWE, and every single purchase had delivered exactly what he had paid for. What he was about to buy in the weeks following The Undertaker's disappearance was simply the most expensive and most elaborate acquisition of his career. He had found a man, a very specific kind of man, someone with the right physical dimensions, the right movement, the right presence, and most importantly, the right willingness to set aside whatever identity he had previously carried and step into the most recognizable and most carefully protected persona in professional wrestling history in exchange for whatever financial arrangement DiBiase's bottomless resources could provide. The transaction itself happened away from the cameras and away from the audience, in the private shadows where DiBiase had always conducted his most important business. But the result of that transaction arrived on WWE television with a suddenness that left the audience genuinely uncertain about what they were seeing, because when this new figure first emerged, dressed in the Undertaker's black, moving with a deliberate and measured pace that echoed everything the real Deadman had established, the resemblance was close enough to produce a moment of genuine confusion before the doubt began creeping in around the edges. What DiBiase had purchased was not simply a physical imitation, but a remarkably committed performance that understood, at least on a surface level, what made the Undertaker's character so compelling and so difficult to dismiss. The fake Undertaker wore the same dark ring attire. He carried himself with the same slow, almost processional deliberateness that had always made the real Undertaker's entrances feel like events rather than simply walks to the ring. His eyes carried the same vacant thousand-yard stare that the real Deadman had perfected over 4 years of continuous refinement. Standing at a distance under arena lighting, in the absence of the real article for comparison, the illusion held together with a convincing enough quality to make DiBiase's gamble feel, at least initially, like it might actually work. With DiBiase by his side handling all the talking and all the business arrangements that the Undertaker character had never been required to handle for himself, the fake Undertaker began making his presence felt across WWE television in a way that was impossible to ignore. He competed, he won, he moved through his opponents with the same unhurried efficiency that fans had come to associate with the real Deadman, dispatching challenges with a cold and methodical consistency that at least superficially replicated the kind of dominance the WWE Universe had spent 4 years watching the genuine article produce. DiBiase stood ringside through all of it, his expression carrying the particular brand of smug satisfaction. That had always been his most recognizable emotional register, the look of a man whose plan was unfolding exactly as designed and who wanted everyone watching to understand that he had once again proven his fundamental philosophy correct. The reaction from the WWE Universe was complicated, in a way that spoke to how deeply the real Undertaker's legend had embedded itself into the audience's relationship with the product. Some fans were genuinely unsettled, caught between the visual familiarity of everything the fake Undertaker presented and an instinctive feeling that something fundamental was wrong with what they were watching, like a piece of music played in almost the right key, close enough to recognize, but wrong enough to create a persistent and uncomfortable dissonance. Others were simply confused, lacking enough information to fully process what DiBiase was presenting or what it meant for the real Undertaker, whose absence was still being felt across every corner of WWE's programming. The uncertainty itself was part of what DiBiase had purchased, not just a physical imitation, but a psychological disruption that kept the audience off balance in exactly the way he had intended. For several weeks, the fake Undertaker's presence grew more confident and more established. With every television appearance, and DiBiase's control over the situation seemed to tighten in a way that suggested he had genuinely found a way to do what no legitimate opponent had managed across 4 years of trying to remove The Undertaker from WWE's landscape and replace him with something he could own and direct and weaponize according to his own agenda. The fake Undertaker was not simply a distraction or a short-term ploy. In DiBiase's vision, he was a permanent solution, a controlled and purchased version of the most uncontrollable and unpurchasable force the company had ever produced. For the first time in the real Undertaker's entire existence within WWE, someone believed they had found a way to own the Deadman, and for a brief, deeply unsettling stretch of time, it appeared they might be right. But professional wrestling, like every story worth telling, has a way of producing the exact voice at the exact moment when the truth most needs to be spoken aloud. And the voice that cut through all of DiBiase's carefully constructed deception did not belong to a rival performer or a company, authority figure, or any of the logical candidates who might have been expected to expose what was happening. It belonged to a short, round, dramatically expressive man in a black suit who had been conspicuously absent from WWE television since the real Undertaker's disappearance, a man who had carried that glowing urn for 4 years and who knew, better than anyone alive, exactly what the real Deadman looked like when he moved and breathed and existed in a room. Paul Bearer had been watching everything DiBiase had constructed, and he had seen enough. The moment he stepped back in front of a WWE camera and pointed his finger at the fake Undertaker and told the world what he was looking at, the entire foundation of DiBiase's plan began to shake.